I'm 32 and the night my life split open, a stranger told me my wife was in surgery. That sentence shouldn't exist for me. I don't have a wife. I remember the exact time because the clock on my stove blinked to 17 a.m. like a faulty heartbeat. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with a podcast droning. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and a calm medical voice explained something about a car on the freeway, about jaws of life, about me being listed as the spouse on all the paperwork. The way the voice used the word spouse, like it was a coat I'd left behind and should come pick up, did something to my stomach that I can still feel. I told the voice they had the wrong person, the wrong man, the wrong life. The voice gave me an address and the name of a hospital and said I could argue with the universe in person if I preferred. The line clicked and I was standing in my quiet living room with the taste of sleep in my mouth, looking at a reflection in the black TV screen that could have been anyone's unmarried, ordinary safe. There are moments you can track to the inch. The blue sweatshirt I grabbed from the chair. The keys dropped once and then picked up. The way the city looked like it was holding its breath, few cars, wet pavement, streetlights stretched into bright ropes. I drove to the hospital without turning the radio back on, like music would make it real. The automatic doors opened with a soft sigh, and somewhere a vending machine hummed like a patient machine still trying. The woman at the desk asked for my name, and when I gave it, her eyebrows went up in recognition, like I was late to a meeting I'd scheduled. She pointed me to a chair and said a doctor would be with me soon. My chest felt hollow, as if someone had vacuumed out the air and left a person-shaped shell behind. They brought me into a room that tried too hard to be a living room, softened lighting, a framed print of a coastline, chairs that looked comfortable but weren't. A surgeon told me there had been a multi-car collision, that my wife had a broken femur and mild head trauma, that they were stabilizing her and I could see her after she was out of recovery. The surgeon said my name again, several times, and each time it landed on me like a bowling ball. I said I wasn't married, and the surgeon tried on a careful expression that meant people in shock say strange things. I pulled out my ID, more for me than for them, to make sure my name was still mine. It was. So was my face, a little paler than I remember seeing it. Then they led me down a hall, the kind that reeks of antiseptic and bleach, the kind that has a clock at the end that's always a little fast. I stood in the doorway of a recovery room and saw a woman who could have been anyone from far away and then quickly became someone from too close. Her hair was dark and tangled, a thin line of dried blood near the temple, and Roman 4 taped to her hand, heart monitor winking a metronome. She looked at me with a tired softness that moved like gravity. She knew my name. She knew my address. She said she was relieved I'd come and that she was sorry about the car and the mess and all the usual things one says when one is caught between pain and painkillers. She called me her husband with a familiarity that felt indecent, as if she was standing in my shower without asking. There wasn't a single moment in which I formed a sentence that could hold the absurdity. I just stood there with an expression I recognized from mirrors during bad news, and I tried to inventory what parts of me were steady and what parts weren't. A nurse handed me a clipboard and told me to confirm the insurance. There was a folder. Inside, I saw my name in the spouse field. Everything looked like it had been typed by a real human with a real keyboard in a real office. The insurance company was one I recognized, but not mine. The emergency contact was me. The handwriting next to a phone number looked like my own, which made no sense. In that moment I decided I would not cry and I would not shout. I signed where they told me to sign because it meant she'd be treated anyway, because fighting with paperwork felt like throwing a pillow at a house fire. In the days that followed, because somehow it became days, I learned facts the way you peel a bandage slowly, the woman's name, an apartment address in a neighborhood I don't live in, a job that existed just enough to be plausible. I learned there was a marriage certificate filed in a county that was not mine but could have been, and my name was on it next to hers, like a tattoo on someone else's wrist. When I asked for a copy, they gave me a scan. Font looked official and boring, the worst kind of convincing. A picture of us stood clipped into a plastic frame in her hospital room, one of those cheap acrylic things you get at drugstores. In the picture, I was smiling with my arm around her in front of a mural I've never seen. My face looked like my face except the edges were too clean, as if someone had ironed me. The background had that uncanny smoothness that makes you distrust every pixel. I stared at it until I felt queasy and turned face down the way people do with mirrors after a death. I am not naive enough to think my life up until then had been inviolable. I have put my share of pieces online. I post pictures when I eat something pretty, when I run my 3-mile loop and hit a decent time, when I fix something in the apartment I'm too proud to call a rental. But there is a difference between offering breadcrumbs to strangers and someone baking a whole loaf out of them, slicing it, and serving it as a shared meal you never agreed to eat. She had created a version of me with enough fidelity to fool a system built on forms. She'd lived under my name like it was a roof and the storm outside was permanent. He was what I didn't expect, that the first feeling after panic would be shame. Not over anything I did, but over how much it stirred something warm to be known so meticulously by a stranger. She knew the small scar on my knee from the skateboarding accident when I was a kid. She knew the way I take my coffee, the brand of running shoes I buy, the name of the band I listened to in college until the lead singer quit. None of those facts is sacred, but stacked together they felt like a shrine. I hated that I felt seen. I hated that the thing inside me that has been starving for years looked up and asked if this was food. I kept telling myself I had to call the police, that it was simple, that a crime was a crime even if it wore my favorite hoodie. The reality was complicated. There were cops already orbiting the hospital because there had been a crash, and they asked me questions, and I answered them with the blandness of a man who doesn't want to encourage company. I said I didn't have details, that I was tired, that I needed to sit down. No one says please arrest the woman in a bed because she made me her husband without asking. There isn't a checkbox for that. When she slept, I read the chart at the foot of the bed like it would contain an answer. When she was awake, I learned to speak in soft sentences about pain levels and ice chips and sounds in the hallway. She was careful with me even when she wasn't fully present, careful in a way that said she knew she'd broken something fragile and was trying not to make it worse. She told me, in drifting fragments, that she had nobody. She told me that one life had closed on her like a door and she found another left ajar with my name on it and walked in. She didn't say why she picked me, and I said I didn't need to hear it even though I did. I told myself I was collecting information. I told myself I was being compassionate. I told myself many things, and I believed each one just long enough to get to the next. The first time I went to her apartment, I used the keys a nurse handed me because the nurse thought I was the husband and because I had nodded when people called me that. The building was one of those recent renovations that tries to look historic by installing expensive lighting. Her door had a small wreath even though it was nowhere near the holidays. Inside, the place was clean with a brittle kind of order, surfaces polished as if anxiety has a spray bottle and microfiber cloth. On the coffee table was a binder. The cover had my last name in block letters. I sat for a long time before I opened it. Inside were pages sorted into tabs like a project plan for a life we didn't live. Work, the family, the habits, the financial. My LinkedIn profile printed out and annotated in pencil. A screenshot of that college band's Wikipedia page. Notes on the building where I live, down to the fact that my mailbox gets sticky in the summer. There was a list of my favourite meals cooked by nobody, and a note about the time I leave for my run when I'm training for the tank. She had drawn a map of my neighbourhood on graph paper, marking coffee shops I frequent like flags on a battlefield. It was organised, meticulous, and arranged in the way that compulsion is a cousin of love. On the last tab, there were copies of forms with my name typed where our spouses would go. There were also drafts with handwriting that wasn't quite my own but tried. She had practiced my signature beside a YouTube tutorial on penmanship. She had practiced the arc of the M in my name until it looked like the letter had stopped resisting. I closed the binder and put it back on the table and pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until I saw a fireworks display behind my eyelids. If you're waiting for the part where I call the police, here is where you will be disappointed. I did what cowards and romantics do, nothing decisive, everything incremental. I threw away an envelope in her kitchen with an account number scribbled on it. I set the binder back in the exact place I found it and then moved it half an inch so it looked less like a stage. I watered a plant that had sagged. I replaced milk in her fridge that had expired. I told myself that was kindness, not collusion. Back at the hospital, bills began to loom like weather. Insurance companies called and used a voice that made catastrophe sound methodical. On a form, the box for a responsible party had my name in it because of course it did. I work in operations for a company that sells software to people who fill out forms professionally. I know how the world prefers tidy answers. I told a billing person that I needed time and watched the word time evaporate from my mouth like breath in winter. I put my own credit card down for something small and told myself it was a stopgap. Then the habit formed. Then the line blurred. Somewhere in there, the story of my childhood started narrating itself over the present, which is what happens when reality won't explain itself. My father left when I was 6, the kind of leaving that's still happening 26 years later. My mother had a way of looking at the front door like it was a trick coin. Heads, he's back. Tails, he's gone again. I grew up with a very practical understanding of what it means to be chosen and unchosen. I chose safe women and safe jobs and safe apartments. I kept the volume at a level the neighbours would not complain about. If love is a country, I never bothered to apply for a passport. The woman in the bed had forged one for me and stamped it without asking. There is a part of me that will always be the kid waiting in the window for a car that doesn't turn onto our street. That part sat in a hospital chair for days and felt the shock of being expected. Her head healed enough for conversations to have edges. Her leg was on the long-planned surgery, a brace, months of rehabilitation. She apologized to me for the inconvenience, which was the word she used, as if she had knocked over my drink at a bar. I watched her eyes when she said it, and they were not the eyes of a con artist reveling in a trick. They were the eyes of a person who had built a life raft out of found materials and was embarrassed by the seams. She talked around the truth the way you speak gently to a skittish animal you don't want to flee. I learned eventually that before my name, there had been other names barely tried on and discarded. Not stolen, borrowed, she said in the sorts of ways she could. There had been a man who treated her like a recurring bill and not a person, and she'd escaped in a hurry that made precision impossible. There had been a job where everybody knew everything about everybody else and none of it was enough to count as knowing. There had been a mother she visited but did not depend on, a father she didn't talk about. She had become a person built out of contingency plans. My name wasn't the first door she tried, but it was the one that opened with the least effort. She liked the way my life read, stable, decent, not greedy, not cruel. She could have picked a richer man. She picked someone who did his dishes. When the police came to ask follow-up questions about the accident, I said I was her husband because that is what the paperwork said and because correcting them required a level of clarity I couldn't find. Their clipboard didn't have a box for I am the target of a careful kindness that looks like a crime. They weren't there about identity or marital status, they were there about velocity and impact and lanes closed during rush hour. I answered what they asked and nothing more. After they left, I sat at the end of her bed and told myself that I had crossed a line I couldn't redraw. If I sound like I'm defending her, I also have a file in my head where the words fraud and violation are underlined in red. The file is thick. It contains the uninvited hand in my pocket feeling for an ID card. It contains the nausea I felt touching a marriage certificate where my name had been flattened into someone else's plan. It contains the fear that if she could find my scar from skateboarding, what else could she find or forge? It contains the terror that my own story is porous and any person with determination could siphon it into theirs. I kept waiting for anger to take over. Anger did arrive, but it didn't stay. Anger is glamorous in stories. It puts on leather and smashes windows and calls lawyers. Mine came wearing sweatpants, made coffee, scrolled headlines, and then got bored and took a nap. In a space anger left open, other things grew, smaller and more humiliating things like curiosity and pity and a version of admiration I hate admitting. She had built a life out of imagination and grit. She had found a way to be less alone. She had found me, and even if the way she did it was not allowed, there was an intention in it that felt disturbingly close to what people call love. I started telling friends I was busy. I stopped answering texts with anything but thumbs up. I told my boss I had a family situation, which was the first time that phrase had ever made sense in my mouth. I let myself be the person the hospital staff would nod to when they discussed discharge and physical therapy and at-home needs. I asked questions about ramps and bath seats as if I knew the layout of a home I didn't live in, as if I were someone's person. The more I acted like a husband, the harder it was to figure out where pretending ended. The day they discharged her, the sky was annoyingly perfect. The kind of blue that looks airbrushed. I drove her to her apartment in a borrowed car because my hatchback is not conducive to leg braces and because my hands needed something bigger to hold on to. I carried her up the stairs and felt the weight of her body as a kind of truth. I knew where the glasses were because I'd been there before. I opened her window to let out the smell of antiseptic that had followed us home. She asked me to bring the binder from the table, and I said I couldn't, and she nodded like she'd always known that was the right answer. Those first weeks at her place fell into a rhythm. Morning pills, physical therapy, homework, the afternoon nap that left the crease in her cheek, the nighttime documentaries we half-watched. I changed bandages and learned the precise sound of her refrigerator when it was about to kick on. I switched between my apartment and hers so that my plants wouldn't die and my neighbours wouldn't ask questions about his sudden wife. When the nurse came by with a clipboard and checked boxes with quiet satisfaction, she would smile at me in that way people do when they like the shape of your family. I didn't correct her. Somewhere along the line I had become a man people recognized as a husband even if the law had been tricked into saying so. Money leaked out of me in ways that were both reckless and measured. I bought her a better pillow than the hospital sent home. I paid the physical therapist in cash once when there was a problem with billing. I checked my balances and saw numbers go down in a way that didn't panic me as much as it should have. I called my bank to add an alert, then ignored the alert when it buzzed. I told myself that when I finally called someone with a badge, I would provide a full accounting like an honest criminal. Trust is a weird animal. It arrived for me on the smallest feat. She never asked for my passwords. She never suggested joint anything. She didn't insist I stay when I needed to leave. She did not perform gratitude like a play. She simply lived near me, absorbing the fact of me the way a room absorbs light. She told me a story about a childhood in which the adults in charge treated promises like napkins, disposable. She described growing into a person allergic to being outside of a circle. She said my name softly sometimes like it was a good-tasting word, and I had to look away. I grew up believing I was too boring to be dangerous. It turns out boring men can be canals for floods anyway. I know what some people will say. That I got played, that I'm a mark, that loneliness is easy to catfish. They will not be entirely wrong. They never are. I can list the moments where a smarter man would have stomped the brake. I can list the laws I considered and then set aside like shoes I wasn't going to wear. But there is another list forming too. The list of moments in which I felt more awake than I had in years. The list of moments where my life felt like it had finally turned to face me. The list of moments where I heard how my own voice sounded in a room and thought, there you are, I wondered if you were still around. It is easier to explain betrayal when it is clean. It is easier to explain good when it has no blood on it. This wasn't clean. The lies were braided with care. The theft was wrapped around a genuine tenderness. If you've never had someone choose you with the intensity of a survivor who found a loophole, I don't recommend it and I don't entirely regret it. Both can be true. Lots of opposites can be true when you stop insisting on being simple. There were bad days. Days when I felt a bolt of rage that I was living inside a role I didn't audition for. Days when I pictured myself at a police station, sliding that binder across a desk, watching realization bloom on a detective's face. Days when I wanted my name back immediately in all capital letters. Days when being called husband made my neck itch. On those days, she would watch me notice myself, and she would give me the space to hate her. There is a kind of generosity in letting someone despise you temporarily without trying to stop them. It doesn't fix anything, but it makes room. I also learned the ways I had been complicit in my own emptiness long before she ever showed up. I had cut corners on intimacy the way you cut corners on sleep at works until you wake up in public. I kept friends at sarcasm distance. I dated people who were good on paper and then blamed paper when it didn't turn into skin. I told myself I wanted a quiet life, but what I really wanted was a life that required nothing messy from me. She forced a mess onto my coffee table, and there's a part of me that wants to send her a thank you card and a part that wants to send her the bill. Eventually, the leg brace came off. The scar on her thigh looked like someone had drawn a mouth that tells the truth. She walked from the couch to the window and back like a person learning choreography. We celebrated with takeout, which is what you do when you're not really a couple and very much are. I slept at her place that night, not on the couch. The next morning I woke to the sound of the city already busy, and I watched her before she opened her eyes. There was a softness on her face like the few seconds before you remember whatever is heavy. I thought, this is the moment where some men run and some men stay. I thought, I'm not sure yet which category I'm in, but I'm in motion. The binder stayed on the shelf. We did not look at it. It hummed in the room like a small, dangerous appliance left on. We lived around it. We learned each other in the normal ways people do when they meet with the volume turned down, the preferences about throw blankets, the strong opinions about whether pineapple belongs on pizza, the afternoon slump at exactly 3:14 p.m. I learned the way she says my name when she's teasing, when she's tired, when she's worried. She learned the noise my knees make when I stand after sitting too long. Mundane intimacy is still intimacy. A month after she was cleared to work from home again, a letter arrived addressed to both of us at her apartment. It was from some county office I had never dealt with, something about a confirmation of records. I held the envelope and felt the fork in my road sharpen. She saw my face and became very still. I opened it and read phrases that pretended the world is as simple as ink, registration, certificate, spouse. The letter wanted me to be a man cleanly attached to a woman, and it wanted her to be a woman legally attached to a man, and it wanted the two of us to answer with a check mark. I didn't answer. Not then. I put the letter in a drawer and closed it. She watched me do that and nodded like a person watching a breath test she was sure she would fail. That night, I lay awake and considered how the future would be expensive no matter what. I could pay in money to unwind what had been wound around me. I could pay in shame by telling the truth to people who prefer stories with crisp edges. I could pay in years by deciding to stay, by learning how to trust a person who had started with theft and moved toward honesty. I could pay in the currency of leaving, the one that buys you a kind of relief and a kind of emptiness. I didn't sleep. I thought about every time my father left and came back and left again, about how he taught me that uncertainty is a climate you can live in if you dress in layers. I thought about my mother making pancakes for dinner when the money was stretched, saying we were doing it as a treat when it was clearly math. I thought about the way this woman had built a life with my name because hers didn't feel like a place anyone could find. I thought about the way I felt when she asked where I'd been if I was late, not demanding, just curious, like the world cared whether or not my car turned onto the right street. When morning came, I did something as reckless and as ordinary as boiling water. I made coffee, poured 2 cups, and told her I'd hire a lawyer. Her face went expressionless, the emotional equivalent of slamming brakes. I told her I needed to know exactly what existed with my name on it. I told her I would fix what needed fixing, that I would go to offices with fluorescent lights and talk to people who love their staplers, and we would unwind the paperwork until only the truth remained. And then I told her the truth might still include her. I won't romanticize what followed. There were lines. There were fees. There were meetings where I was talked to like a child, and meetings where I was asked for a story I could not tell briefly. There were moments I thought, if a movie were made about this, the audience would stand up and walk out because it's too much bureaucracy. There were also small kindnesses, a clerk who gave me a form without charging me because I looked like I'd been there too long, a security guard who pointed me toward the right elevator, a stranger who held the door. A lawyer asked me why I was not pressing charges, and I gave him an answer that wasn't on his menu, because she fixed something I didn't know was broken and she broke something I didn't know I needed, and I am not yet sure which way is more. We did not make everything official. We made some things honest. We corrected records that mattered to banks and health care providers. We left one thing alone on purpose, the word husband in spaces that didn't ask for proof. Not to trick anyone, or to allow the world to be less literal. We used that word the way people use a borrowed jacket on a cold night and return it in the morning with a thank you. Sometimes we didn't return it. If you are waiting for the police in this story, they never arrived. Not because they couldn't, but because I didn't invite them. That is the part that will divide people. Some will say I am weak or foolish. Some will say I am romantic to the point of self-harm. Some will say I deserved what happened, that I had it coming for being inattentive to the way my life could be used. Few will quietly understand that sometimes you slip into a story that fits your bones better than the one you wrote for yourself, and when that happens, the moral math blows. I kept thinking about vows I've never said. The good ones start with honesty, with I take you as you are and as you are not yet. She had introduced herself to me with a lie and then spent months telling me small truths that made the lie flicker. Each truth was a thread, and together they formed something like cloth. I could see the hole in it. I could also see the warmth. If this were a cautionary tale, it would end with me alone in my correct apartment with my name scrubbed clean and my lesson learned. If this were a high story, we'd run off with money and new passports. It's neither. Most lives are neither. Most lives are a clumsy mix of paperwork and breath and the way your chest moves when you hear someone say your name like a promise. We made dinner last night. We ate on the couch because neither of us can commit to buying a table. We watched a movie about people who find each other in impossible ways, and we laughed at the unbelievable parts and didn't comment on the realistic ones. The binder is still on the shelf. I haven't thrown it away. Maybe that makes me sentimental. Maybe it makes me evidence. I know what it looks like from the outside, a man too soft to be safe, a woman too cunning to be trusted. I also know what it feels like from here, a fragile, living thing building itself in the open air. I am not proud of all the choices I made. I am not ashamed of all of them either. I can live inside that in-between. So here is the ending that will make some of you angry, and some of you write paragraphs, and some of you close the window because you can't with me. I didn't turn her in. I chose not to. I walked past the police station on purpose and kept walking. I held her hand in a waiting room while we fixed the easy parts and left the impossible ones to time. Somewhere between the second cup of hospital coffee and the first morning she walked without the brace, I fell in love with a woman who had borrowed my name to survive. It sounds like a bad song. It is my real life. You can call me a fool. You can call her a criminal. Both might be true. But when I think about that phone call at 2:17 a.m. about the surgeon saying the word spouse like it was a coat, I keep coming back to this. I put it on and it fit. Not perfectly, not immediately, not without scraping skin, just enough to stay warm. I don't know what happens next. I know that today, when she says my name, I hear it as something earned, not stolen. And if you think that makes me part of the crime, you might be right. If you think it makes me human, you might be right too. Which truth you choose to hold says more about you than about us. I can live with that. I've been living with worse.